Good morning. I'd like to thank you for your kind invitation. I'm really sorry for not being there. The paper I'm going to read has been written with the kind contribution of my colleague Gianfranco De Simone. In the methodology of the research into the unconscious mind developed by Massimo Fagioli, the study of the psychic reality and of psychopathology is carried out within the therapeutic relationship, in a dynamic relational perspective to be intended as identification of those movements of the mind, of images and affections, which during one's own development and within one's own relationships may have altered and thus jeopardized the achievement of the subject's original identity. Based on Fagioli's theoretical premises, the origin of mental diseases is to be set in early experiences and one's first interpersonal relationships. This highlights how linking the term disease to the term mind occurs for a theoretical approach that does not consider psychopathological expressions to be the consequence of the lesion of one single function. Rather, they are the alteration, the lack, or the loss of that original psychophysical unity of human beings at birth, which is characterized by one's own activity and capability to act, capability to imagine, or memory, which all together characterize the first nucleus of self. Now I'd like to read you a few lines from Fagioli's book, Death, Instinct and Knowledge. In the analytic setting, there exists a specific interpersonal situation that is not usually taken into account in other human relationships. The transference and counter-transference relationship is outlined and accepted in the initial therapeutic contract. Afterwards, every interpretation will be based on this type of relationship. And all psychoanalysts know that frequently, or rather always, one of the main problems they must face is the behavioral or simply unconscious reaction of the patient when they cancel one or more sessions. The analyst is absent, the patient experiences frustration. So, from the first few lines of his book, Fagioli highlights how the concept of absence is to be intended as a psychological absence more than physical absence, meaning when, despite being physically there, the analyst is absent, does not comprehend or does not interpret correctly. And this disinterest, this absence is not the lack of something, but rather it is actively directing a pulsion against the external object. In this context, Fagioli thus considers the concept of frustration and links it to the concept of absence. Now let's try to explain how. First, we should consider Frustration meant as opposing the patient's needs, as preventing the patient from satisfying his or her partial and isolated pulsions, because their direct satisfaction would lead the patient to introject the analyst, and thus to projective identification and a sadomasochistic relationship, where the analyst is turned into a persecutory phantom. In this case, the lack of frustration implies the analyst's positive absence. In this context, the term frustration binds with the term absence, as it corresponds to the analyst not getting involved in the satisfaction of a patient's need, meaning the patient expressing an isolated pulsion against the analyst. It is frustration absence, which is to be intended as the analyst's comprehension for and interest in the patient. We may say that in that sense the analyst is absent because he or she refuses the patient's split or partial dimensions of relationship. However, this does not mean be indifferent or neutral. Rather, by carrying out this counter-transferential dynamic, the therapist allows the patient to reintegrate his or her pulsions, which can thus be interpreted. We said frustration as opposing the patient's needs. Now the second one, frustration meant as opposing the patient's requirements. In this case, frustration becomes aggressiveness because the analyst should always satisfy the patient's requirements. By helping with interpretation, the patient listens and absorbs the analyst's words and care. The analyst should help the patient absorb the other's qualities through the introjection of the image and thought of the object analyst, rather than the introjection of the object. In this case, the lack of satisfaction becomes frustration aggressiveness, meaning absence, which, as we said earlier, is to be intended as pulsion aggressiveness rather than the lack of something. Massimo Fagioli wrote about disappearance fantasy and unconscious calm sea in a typewritten volume that circulated amongst the members of SPI, Italian Association for Psychoanalysis, in Rome in 1971. It was the object of debate for its innovative theoretical contents and criticism of the inconsistencies of the classic theory. In Death Instinct Knowledge, Fagioli described the discovery of a phenomenon that was verbalized with the oxymoron disappearance fantasy, to indicate the capability of the original unconscious to imagine existence by annulling the stimulus of light as a reaction to and a defense against the physical external environment that is perceived as dangerous. Fagioli refused Freud's idea that there is no caesura at birth, just as he refused the idea that there is no scotoma and that there is only repression. He highlighted the immense caesura that exists between the darkness of the intrauterine condition and the light of the extrauterine reality. The disappearance fantasy as a reaction to a visual relationship which indisputably precedes the infant's relation with the breast determines the onset of an unconscious memory that differs from conscious recollections and that Fagioli defined as unconscious calm sea. Fagioli refused the idea based on which negative and destructive affections are the motor for onset of psychic reality. 50 years ago, human birth theory clearly established what is now a fact, as it has been shown by development science and neonatology. Positive emotions, affections such as joy, the interest for, and surprise are fundamental for healthy mental development. For instance, they provide stimuli for exploration, interaction, and learning. The study of the process of birth has highlighted three basic aspects in Fagioli's theorization. First, the existence of an unrepressed unconscious that is much more original than the repressed unconscious, and it is present as early as birth. Second, the existence of a type of memory which is much more primitive than conscious recollections, that elaborates more archaic sensations and experiences that are linked to the great caesura of birth and newborn's first relationships. And third, the non-narcissistic relational nature of newborns, who can react to the external environment and the new stimulus, which is light, and are able to image the object in the relation. At the end of the first chapter of The Atheist in Knowledge, in a subchapter called A Case History, Fagioli described his clinical practice as it emerged from his psychotherapeutic relationship with a very severe psychotic patient. In there, Fagioli showed how theory and practice, or practice and theory, are inextricably linked to one another. Is it an idea, an intuition, which is then confirmed in the daily therapeutic practice of the relationship with patients that comes first? Or is it the actuality of the therapeutic relationship, the clinical practice, that makes thoughts arise and gives shape to them? In this subchapter, Massimo Fagioli, who was certain of his identity as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, dived into the dialectical therapeutic relationship, and he confirmed his theoretical thoughts in his daily therapeutic practice, never fearing confrontation with the patient's mental disease. Fagioli described how he had carried out a long individual analysis with a young man who was born because a child had died beforehand, and how the patient had managed to find his child again in the therapeutic relationship. This was also the case for thousands of people who attended Analisi Collettiva, a unique therapeutic practice which Fagioli carried out for more than 40 years. Fagioli's thought about human birth asserts original equality between men and women, blacks and whites, the face without physiognomy, that is the same in all human beings who, at birth, begin to move their mind in the same way. Thank you.